There's a particular quality to the light in southern Iraq just as the sun begins to fall. The air cools, the dust settles, and for a moment the desert seems to exhale, releasing the heat it's held all day. Modern highways cut through landscapes where ancient cities once stood, where canals once carried water between fields of barley and wheat. There's now only sand and the occasional crumbling wall, half buried and forgotten. It's easy to drive past these places and see nothing but emptiness. Ruins that mean little to anyone except archaeologists and tour guides. But if you stop, if you stand there in that fading light, you might feel it a kind of weight in the air. Not oppressive, but present. The sense that something immense once existed here. Something that mattered deeply to the people who built it and to the world that came after. We're taught a certain story about human history. It goes something like this. For most of our existence, we were hunter-gatherers. Then, around 6,000 years ago, we figured out agriculture, built cities, invented writing, and slowly climbed our way towards civilization. The story is clean, linear, comforting in its simplicity. But what if it's incomplete? What if, in the land between two rivers, there existed a civilization that understood things we're only beginning to rediscover? What if they possessed knowledge about creation, about the cosmos, about human purpose? Knowledge that didn't come from centuries of gradual development, but appeared almost fully formed, as though handed down from somewhere else? The Sumerians are mentioned in passing in most history classes, if they're mentioned at all. They're presented as one of the world's first civilizations, notable for inventing the wheel and cuneiform writing. Important, certainly, but primitive, ancient, superseded by later, more advanced cultures. That version is convenient. It's also misleading. Beneath the sand of Iraq lie hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. They're covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay before it hardened, a script that modern scholars call cuneiform. For centuries, no one could read them. The language was dead, the culture vanished. The tablets sat in museums and private collections, mute and mysterious. Then, slowly, over decades of painstaking work, linguists began to crack the code. They started to translate the texts. And what they found wasn't just ancient shopping lists or tax records, though there were plenty of those. They found something else entirely. They found creation stories, epics, cosmologies, detailed accounts of gods who came from the heavens, who shaped humanity with their own hands, who gave knowledge and purpose to the first people. These stories were written in a language that predates Hebrew. They describe events that sound eerily familiar to anyone raised on the Bible or the Quran, yet they're older, thousands of years older. The similarities aren't coincidental. The differences aren't trivial. These tablets tell a story your history teacher never mentioned. A story about where we came from that doesn't fit neatly into the frameworks we've been given. A story that raises uncomfortable questions about what we know, what we believe, and who decided which version of the past we'd be taught. The Sumerians didn't just record their own history. They recorded something they believed was much older, much stranger, and much more important. They wrote about beings who descended from the sky, about genetic experiments and divine bloodlines, about cities built before the flood and knowledge preserved after it. And then, somehow, all of this was forgotten. Not gradually, not naturally, but decisively. Libraries burned, temples crumbled, the language died, and when new civilizations rose in the same lands, they told different stories, softer stories, stories that painted their gods as distant and unknowable, rather than present and dangerously real. Tonight, we're going to remember what they knew, and ask why it was forgotten. But first, we need to understand who these people actually were. Around 4,500 years before the birth of Christ, something unusual happened in southern Mesopotamia. A people emerged who called themselves the Black-Headed Ones. We know them as the Sumerians, and from the very beginning they were different. Most civilizations develop slowly. You can trace them back through layers of time, watching as nomadic tribes settle, as villages grow into towns, as writing gradually evolves from simple pictographs to complex systems. There's a progression, an archaeological trail you can follow. With the Sumerians, that trail doesn't exist. They appeared with no warning, already writing, already building cities, already mapping the stars as if someone had given them a blueprint. Within a span of time that seems impossibly short by historical standards, they had constructed Uruk, a city that housed tens of thousands of people. They built Ur, with its massive ziggurat rising above the flat plains. They founded Eridu, which they believed was the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven. They didn't just build, they invented the wheel, the plough, the sailboat. They developed a mathematical system based on the number 60, a system so sophisticated we still use it today when we measure time and angles. They studied the movements of planets and stars with precision that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. They created one of the first written law codes, establishing principles of justice and social order. All of this happened remarkably fast. Historians have theories, of course. Perhaps the Sumerians migrated from somewhere else, bringing their knowledge with them. Perhaps they absorbed ideas from neighboring cultures we haven't yet discovered. Perhaps the archaeological record is simply incomplete, and we're missing the gradual development that must have occurred. Perhaps. But the uncertainty remains. The Sumerians themselves claimed they were taught by the Apkallu 7 wise beings who came before the flood and gave humanity the arts of civilization. They didn't describe this as mythology. They recorded it as history. Their method of recording was painstaking. Scribes would take a piece of wet clay, flattening it into a tablet the size of a hand or sometimes much larger. Then, using a cut reed with a wedge-shaped tip, they would press symbols into the soft surface, each mark deliberate and precise. Once covered with text, the tablet would be left to dry in the sun or baked in a fire until it hardened into something nearly indestructible. This is why we still have them. Thousands of years later, these clay tablets survive when papyrus scrolls and wooden records have crumbled into dust. The Sumerians, perhaps without realizing it, created one of the most durable archives in human history. They didn't waste this medium on trivia alone. Yes, there are records of grain shipments and tax collections and legal disputes, but there are also creation epics, star catalogues, hymns to gods, detailed genealogies tracing the lineage of divine beings who walked the earth and ruled over humanity. These weren't entertainment. They weren't bedtime stories told to children. They were sacred knowledge, preserved by priests and stored in temple libraries, copied and recopied across generations to ensure nothing was lost. Modern scholars call them myths. They categorize them alongside Greek legends and Norse sagas, colorful stories that reveal cultural values but shouldn't be taken literally, and perhaps that's accurate. Perhaps the Sumerian creation accounts are purely symbolic, attempts by early humans to make sense of a confusing world. But there's another possibility. What if these texts are something else entirely? What if they're not myths at all, but memories? Encoded records of actual events, passed down through generations, preserved in clay because what they described was too important to forget. The Sumerians didn't treat these stories casually. They guarded them. They ritualized them. They built their entire civilization around the framework these texts provided. Their cities were organized according to divine decree. Their kings ruled by heavenly mandate. Their calendar, their festivals, their laws, all of it flowed from the cosmology recorded in those tablets. They believed they were recording truth, not poetry, not allegory, truth. But the most extraordinary thing the Sumerians left behind wasn't their cities or their inventions. It was their explanation of where everything came from, including us. They were never meant to survive this long, yet the clay tablets endured in the quiet stillness, beneath layers of shifting earth, waiting for the distant day when human hands would raise them back into the light. Buried under fallen walls and drifting sands, they slept through forgotten empires, their edges crumbling, but their messages still pressed deep into the clay by ancient styluses. When 19th century excavators brushed away the soil, they realized they were holding the remnants of voices that had been silent for thousands of years. For decades, the tablets remained elegant mysteries. The wedge-shaped signs suggested rhythm and intention, but the meaning was sealed away, the language lost to time. Museums filled with shelves of unread stories, each tablet a muted whisper from a world beyond memory. Scholars copied the symbols, compared repeated clusters, and traced subtle variations, hoping for a spark of understanding. Still, the silence persisted, as if the tablets were determined to wait until the right minds approached them with patience rather than ambition. Only in the 1,850 seconds did the script begin to yield. After painstaking comparisons with multilingual inscriptions, cuneiform finally cracked open, and its voice emerged with astonishing clarity. Suddenly, the tablets spoke of kings and rituals, floods and dreams, the anxieties of farmers, the ambitions of rulers, and the questions of priests who watched the sky for meaning. These were not abstractions or legends shaped over centuries. They were direct transmissions from people who had lived long before the world began to write its own history. Among the most extraordinary discoveries were the creation narratives. The Enuma Elish appeared with its sweeping tale of cosmic struggle, where the heavens and earth were shaped through forces violent and sacred. The Epic of Gilgamesh followed closely, bearing within it an account of a great flood described with such precision that scholars could not ignore the echoes that reverberated into later traditions. These stories predated many well-known narratives by centuries, and their tone felt intimate and immense, as if the earliest storytellers had spoken with a clarity later generations softened. Yet the tablets were fragile. Some arrived shattered, others missing corners, and many carried cracks that cut through vital lines. Whole passages faded into silence, leaving gaps that invited reflection but resisted certainty. Even so, a beauty lived within their damaged forms. Each wedge was the imprint of a steady hand, pressing meaning into wet clay, a deliberate act of preservation against the erosion of time. Their survival felt improbable, and their incompleteness made the survival even more precious. As translations multiplied, patterns emerged that scholars could not overlook. Accounts of creation, divine conflict, and the ordering of the cosmos appeared in forms older than narratives that later shaped cultures across continents. These parallels did not accuse or diminish. They revealed a lineage of ideas traveling from one generation to the next, reshaped by storytellers, yet rooted in something ancient. The tablets suggested that humanity has always searched for origins, carrying old answers forward even as new questions formed. For researchers, the revelations were exhilarating and bittersweet. So much remained unreadable, yet enough survived to illuminate the earliest attempts to explain the unknown. Within the surviving lines lay a realization. The Sumerian creation story was stranger, more intricate, and more specific than the versions that came later. Their words still stir questions that echo through time. Even now, as experts revisit the fragments with new tools and shifting perspectives, the tablets continue to reveal subtle details that were once overlooked, inviting a deeper reading of the ancient mind and reminding us that every recovered line is part of a much larger tapestry, waiting to be understood by future generations, seeking clarity and insight too. So what did these tablets actually say? What story did the Sumerians tell about the beginning of everything? In the beginning, there was only silence, a stillness so complete that even the memory of movement had not yet been imagined. No land rested beneath the sky, because neither land nor sky existed. Only two ancient waters drifted in darkness, timeless and without boundary. Apsu, the deep freshwater abyss, moved with a quiet steadiness, while Tiamat, the great salt sea, stretched endlessly around him. Their presence filled the void, not as deities shaped by worship, but as elemental forces whose essence stirred the first faint tremors of creation. They were not parents in the way later stories would describe divine origins. They were currents of potential, drifting close, then drawing apart, as if testing the meaning of existence. Where they touched, the darkness shifted. Their mingling created currents that swirled with unfamiliar energy, and from these currents emerged the earliest sparks of life. It was a creation not spoken into being but formed through union, through the meeting of opposing waters. The ancients imagined this moment not as a miracle, but as a natural unfolding, the way rivers merge or tides pull against the shore. From this mingling rose shapes more defined than water, figures whose presence transformed the stillness into motion. These were the first gods, young and radiant, yet chaotic, pushing outward as if the universe were too small to contain their growing force. Among them were beings whose names echoed through centuries of tablets. Anu, who would one day hold the sky, Ki, who would become the earth beneath countless civilizations, and others whose roles shifted as myths travelled from Sumer to Babylon and beyond. They did not appear fully formed or eternal. They emerged from the meeting of Apsu and Tiamat, shaped by layers of story, but rooted in an ancient vision where divinity had a lineage. Even the sky had a birth, and the earth had a mother, and this alone set the Sumerian tale apart from the later belief that a single voice brought everything into being. The early gods stirred the waters with restless energy. Their presence introduced sound into the void, soft pulses, faint vibrations, murmurs that hinted at future storms. They filled the darkness with movement, unaware that their vitality disrupted the ancient calm Apsu had kept for uncounted ages. The abyss had known only stillness, and the new motions felt like an intrusion. Yet Tiamat, vast and enveloping, held them within her depths with a quiet acceptance, as though understanding that creation always begins with a tension between calm and change. As the gods multiplied, the currents thickened. The void was no longer void, but a swelling, shifting mass of potential. Anu lifted himself above the others, seeking height where no sky yet existed. Ki stretched beneath, taking on the heaviness of earth even before land had separated from the waters. Their identities were forming in the midst of chaos, shaped not by intention but by the momentum of creation itself. Nothing about this world was predetermined. Everything grew from the mingling of forces older than memory. To the ancient storytellers, this beginning held a strange beauty. Creation was not orderly or gentle. It was fluid, shadowed, and intense. It did not unfold through command but through contact. The first beings were born from the press of one water against another, and their existence carried the rhythm of those primordial tides. Long before later traditions imagined a structured universe built with purpose, the earliest myths spoke of a world arising through a deep and ancient embrace. From these waters came the foundations of heaven and earth, though still unformed, still shifting. Apsu's quiet strength and Tiamat's ceaseless depths created a stage where young gods tested their power, unaware that their very existence would soon challenge the order of the cosmos. The calm before conflict was delicate, suspended like a breath waiting to be released. The rising tension hummed through the waters, a low and steady vibration that hinted at forces building beneath the surface, gathering strength in ways none of the young gods could understand. But this peaceful mingling wouldn't last. From the waters came beings so powerful, so chaotic, that the universe itself would soon be torn apart. The uproar among the younger gods grew with every passing age, their restless energies stirring currents that had once known only silence. What began as soft murmurs became thunderous movements, shaking the still depths where Apsu longed for the quiet that had shaped his earliest existence. He felt the weight of their vitality as a disturbance, something that pushed against the ancient order he had preserved since time began. Tiamat watched them with a patient sadness, sensing change but accepting it as part of creation's rhythm, though she did not yet see how swiftly the balance would rupture. Apsu finally resolved that there was only one way to restore the peace he cherished. He would erase the young gods, returning the universe to the stillness before their birth. When Enki, the god of wisdom, learned of this intent, he understood its consequences. The vibrant world that had just begun to take shape would vanish into silence again. Guided by insight and fear, he moved quietly through the shadows of the abyss and reached Apsu as the ancient power slept. With a strike swift and final, Enki ended the father of the gods, and the first divine murder tore through the fabric of the cosmos. Tiamat's grief rose in waves that shook the void itself. The loss of her companion was unbearable, but the manner of his death awakened something deeper, a rage that transformed her essence. The mother of creation became a storm of vengeance, a rising force that gathered darkness into form. Her body stretched into the shape of a monstrous dragon, wings unfurling with the weight of oceans, her breath carrying the roar of the first winds ever to sound in the void. From her fury, she summoned an army unlike anything the young gods had imagined. Demons shaped from shadow, creatures with bodies forged of storms and poison, beings crafted from the remnants of nightmares yet unspoken. They gathered around her in a vast host, answering the call of her sorrow and wrath. The younger gods trembled at the sight, knowing none among them possessed the strength to stand against their ancient mother in this new, terrifying form. Amid their fear rose a single figure, Marduk, young, brilliant, and already touched by extraordinary power. In older traditions, it was Enlil who stepped forward, but the story remained the same. A champion emerged who was willing to face Tiamat, though not without a price. If he succeeded, he demanded the right to rule over all gods, to become the supreme force in the heavens. Desperation made the others agree, and so the fate of creation rested on the outcome of a single cosmic duel. Armed with winds that he could command as easily as breath, Marduk approached the battlefield. Lightning coiled around him, a net of bright force held ready in his hands. Tiamat rose before him, her massive form blotting out what little sense of space existed in the primordial darkness. Her roar echoed through the waters, shaking the newly born gods who watched with equal measures of dread and hope. Marduk released the winds, driving them into Tiamat's open jaws. The force expanded within her, filling her vast body with raging storms. As she struggled, he loosed an arrow that flew straight into her throat, riding the path carved by the winds. The arrow tore through her, and her cry faded into a silence that spread across the void. Her body collapsed, and the champion seized the moment. With deliberate precision, he split her in two, lifting each half as though shaping the future with his own hands. From one part he formed the sky, stretching her skin wide to create the firmament that would one day hold stars and storms. From the other he shaped the earth, solid and enduring. Creation emerged from the remnants of the mother who had once nurtured all life, a world born from conflict and loss rather than peace. In this ancient tale, the universe did not arise from gentle guidance, but from the decisive end of a cosmic struggle. With Tiamat's body, the gods created heaven and earth, but the universe was still empty, still silent. It needed workers, servants, beings to labor so the gods could rest. And so the gods turned their attention to a radical solution. They would create humanity. In their councils, the gods whispered of shaping new life to awaken the silent world again. In the quiet that followed Tiamat's fall, the young gods gazed upon the new world shaped from her vast body, sensing that creation alone was not enough. The heavens stretched above them, the earth lay beneath, yet everything felt unfinished, waiting for order and intention. They gathered in shimmering chambers woven from wind and starlight, seeking direction after the violence that had birthed their realm. Marduk, lifted by victory and the promises granted before the battle, accepted the mantle of supreme authority. His presence radiated strength and caution in equal measure, as though he understood that ruling a cosmos made from conflict demanded careful structure. Around him, the others waited, ready to shape the laws that would govern their unfolding universe. They began by defining the highest tier of divinity, a circle of great powers later known as the Anunnaki. These were the shapers of fate, the keepers of cosmic memory, each holding authority over essential realms. Anu claimed the heavens, dwelling in the farthest reaches where stars gathered like drifting embers. Enlil oversaw the air and the earth, guiding winds that would one day sweep across fields and cities. Enki tended the deep waters and the mysteries hidden within them, his wisdom flowing through every decision. Together, they formed a council that balanced creation's demands with the lingering echoes of the old chaos, seeking harmony without denying the forces that had birthed their existence. Below the Anunnaki stood the Igigi, the countless younger gods who managed the daily functions of the newborn universe. They tended rivers, shaped clouds, and maintained the subtle mechanisms that kept the heavens and earth aligned. Their labor never ceased, for creation required constant attention. Though divine, they were not limitless. Fatigue clung to them like mist, and their voices often rose in weary complaint. The Sumerians saw this not as imperfection, but as truth. Their gods mirrored the struggles of life, bearing responsibilities that could not be ignored. As the Igigi toiled, the great gods watched the strain deepen, realizing that even celestial beings could falter when burdened with endless work. Over time, the complaints grew louder, echoing through the divine halls where decisions shaped the future. The Igigi approached the Anunnaki with their exhaustion laid bare, describing the relentless tasks that consumed their days and nights. Irrigation channels needed carving, storms required guiding, and the fragile balance between heaven and earth demanded vigilance that left them with little strength to spare. The great gods listened in solemn silence, recognizing the depth of this fatigue. Creation had given them authority, yet responsibility weighed heavily on every tier of their hierarchy. In that moment, they understood that the universe could not flourish if its caretakers crumbled beneath unending toil. A solution was required, something bold enough to shift the order of existence. They convened a grand assembly, a gathering of luminous figures who carried the weight of cosmic law within their voices. The hall shimmered with the glow of unseen fires as debates rose and fell like tides. Some argued that the Igigi should endure, for they had been shaped for labour. Others insisted that the burden had grown too great, that even divine strength frayed under such demands. Marduk listened to every argument, his gaze fixed on the world still young beneath them. At last he spoke, suggesting the creation of a new being, something moulded to withstand the toil that drained the lesser gods. This proposal stirred both curiosity and unease, for it meant reshaping the patterns that defined existence. Still, the idea grew, settling into the minds of the assembled gods as they imagined a being shaped for purpose rather than struggle. They spoke of intelligence tempered by obedience, of hands able to shape earth and carry burdens that drained even divine strength. The Anunnaki envisioned a race that could tend fields, maintain order, and relieve the weary Igigi whose labour had sustained creation. The Igigi sensed hope, that their long toil might end. Yet one question remained. How could such a being be formed? Creating life demanded materials, sacrifice, and a bridge between divine essence and earthly matter. The gods understood that whatever they fashioned would bind them to a new future. The gods were tired of working, so they held a meeting. The solution they chose would change everything. They would create us. But how do you create a thinking being from nothing? The gods had a plan, one involving blood, clay, and the sacrifice of one of their own. In the quiet hall of the divine council, the gods gathered beneath a weight heavier than the waters from which they had risen, each aware that the world they had built demanded a price none wished to name. The Igigi were spent from endless labour, their complaints echoing through chambers that once held only the calm rhythm of cosmic order, and the greater gods knew they could not ignore the strain any longer. Enki, whose wisdom flowed like the deep currents, stepped forward with a proposal that startled even those accustomed to the strange necessities of creation. He suggested forming a new being, one shaped to carry burdens that drained the younger gods by blending clay from the earth with the blood and flesh of a divine sacrifice. The council listened as the implications settled around them, for this was not the crafting of simple creatures, but the weaving of consciousness from elements both mortal and eternal. Yet the question rose with quiet urgency. Which god would give his life to bring this new race into being? And who among them carried an essence potent enough to seed intelligence within clay? The name that emerged was Geshtu-i, spoken with a mixture of reverence and unease, for he was known for insight that surpassed many of his kin. Some recalled how he had questioned the burdens placed on the Igigi, a spark of rebellion stirring in him like a distant storm that never quite broke. Others believed his sacrifice would bring balance, that his keen mind would guide the beings shaped from his remnants toward understanding rather than chaos. Whatever the truth, the council's decision rippled through the heavens with somber finality, as though all creation paused to acknowledge the gravity of the choice. Geshtu-i was seized, and though the ancient texts do not linger on his final moments, the weight of the act hangs like a shadow across the story. His blood, rich with divine awareness, was collected in vessels shaped for ritual, each drop carrying the potential for a mind capable of reflection and questioning. His flesh was prepared with solemn care, acknowledging the paradox of a god's end becoming the beginning of another kind of life. Enki oversaw the gathering of clay, instructing that it be taken from the earth at a place where waters rose and receded, symbolizing the joining of permanence and change. The mother goddess Ninhursag stepped forward, her presence steady and nurturing, ready to undertake the work of shaping this mingled substance into living forms. She mixed the clay and blood with deliberate movements, as though each gesture carried echoes of creation older than memory itself. The mixture thickened under her hands, warm with divine essence, soft with earthly matter, a fusion that held both fragility and astonishing promise. From this sacred blend, she formed 7 portions, each one carefully shaped and set aside like seeds waiting for breath. Then she created 7 more, continuing until 14 rested before her, small yet radiant with the potential for consciousness. These 14 portions became the foundation for the first humans, 7 males and 7 females, each crafted with balance in mind. Within them lay the memory of waters, the firmness of soil, and the subtle spark taken from the mind of a god whose name would echo only faintly through later ages. The storytellers who preserved these tales saw the mixture not as metaphor, but as explanation for humanity's dual nature. They believed humans carried the limitations of clay, worn by time and toil, yet also bore within them the restless intelligence that urged them to build, dream, and question. This divine spark set humanity apart, marking them as more than servants, even though servitude had defined their purpose from the beginning. The gods required workers to maintain creation's machinery, yet those workers would carry awareness powerful enough to marvel at the world they laboured to sustain. Ninhursag shaped each form with care, aware that these beings would carry echoes of the gods' own struggles and desires. She smoothed their features, pressed subtle lines into their forms, and laid them gently upon the earth that would one day bear their descendants. The other gods watched in silence, pondering how beings born from sacrifice might interpret the world around them once awakened. They wondered whether the intelligence inherited from Geshtu-i would kindle loyalty or spark further rebellion. The sacrifice had solved one problem, yet it hinted at others that might rise long after this first creation was complete. Still, the decision held, for the need was great, and the path was set by forces older than any single god. Enki oversaw the process with measured calm, trusting that Ninhursag's hands would translate intention into form with the precision creation demanded. The clay glistened as she worked, reflecting faint traces of divine light that lingered around the gathered assembly. Each portion seemed to hum softly, as though responding to the blood within it, ready to become something neither fully earthly nor wholly divine. The gods sensed the magnitude of what they had set in motion, a creation unlike any before, shaped not from whim but from necessity. In this moment, humanity existed as potential, as silent forms awaiting the breath that would awaken them. The gods looked upon the 14 figures and felt a rare stillness settle over them, aware that these beings would mark a turning point in the history of the cosmos. Life crafted from sacrifice would carry memories the clay alone could never hold, creating a lineage rooted in both devotion and transgression. The blending of earth and divine blood marked the beginning of a story that would unfold across generations, shaping destinies the gods themselves could not foresee. The clay and the blood lay ready, waiting for Ninhursag's final touch, for the creation was not yet finished, and the forms before her still lacked breath and movement. Ninhursag's chamber was quiet when the gods brought the 14 portions of clay and blood to her, a stillness that felt intentional, as though the universe itself understood the delicacy of the work ahead. She stood at the center of the room, surrounded by walls carved with flowing patterns that echoed mountains, rivers, wombs, symbols of beginnings pressed into stone long before this moment. The goddess was known as the mother of all, the one whose hands shaped destinies, yet nothing in her long memory resembled the task before her now. 14 lumps of mixed essence rested on a low altar, each one heavy with potential, still silent, still waiting. Around her gathered 14 birth goddesses, 7 positioned on each side, their presence forming a living symmetry that mirrored the dual nature embedded in the clay. They watched with reverence, understanding that the forms before them were neither divine nor mortal yet, but suspended between what was and what could be. Ninhursag approached the first portion and pinched the clay with careful precision, shaping its features with movements that seemed to flow from instinct and ritual alike. The ancient tablets describe her actions with surprising specificity, noting how she recited incantations under her breath, while smoothing limbs and forming the curves of a face. Her voice carried a low rhythm that felt less like poetry and more like a coded formula, a sequence of words meant to guide the transformation. Each gesture was deliberate, as though she were following instructions preserved from a time before even the gods understood the mechanisms of life. The birth goddesses leaned closer, offering tools and small containers filled with sacred oils, assisting her without interrupting the quiet momentum of creation that pulsed through the chamber like a heartbeat. She shaped the second lump, then the third, moving steadily down the line. The tablets mention her pinching off clay, as if adjusting proportions, refining structure, ensuring balance between strength and vulnerability. The details read almost technical, describing steps that modern readers sometimes interpret as methodical rather than mystical. The 7 male forms emerged first, sculpted from the initial 7 portions, their bodies moulded with broad shoulders and firm limbs, symbols of labor and endurance. The 7 female forms followed, shaped with equal care, their features holding the subtle grace of new life, designed to nurture generations yet unborn. Through it all, the clay remained warm beneath her hands, carrying the essence of the sacrificed god, the spark that would ignite awareness once breath entered these forms. When the shaping was complete, the chamber felt charged with anticipation, yet the process was not finished. The ancient texts speak of a gestation period, suggesting that the clay forms were placed in sacred containers, wombs crafted by the gods themselves. These birthing chambers, described in lines scholars have debated for decades, were said to hold the creations for a span of time until they could awaken fully formed. Some imagine these chambers as symbolic wombs, while others wonder whether they represent something startlingly literal. The descriptions speak of sealed spaces, warmth, and careful monitoring, words that echo through interpretations touching on biology, technology, or rites lost to history. The goddess oversaw the placement of each figure into its chamber, her movements calm yet purposeful, as though she understood that the line between life and unformed matter lay in the smallest details. The number 14 was never explained outright, yet it appeared again and again. 7 males, 7 females, 7 goddesses on either side of Ninhursag. The Sumerians favoured patterns that reflected cosmic balance, cycles of nature, and celestial rhythms. But the precision here carries a strange weight, inviting questions about why creation required such symmetry. The birth goddesses recited their own incantations as they sealed the chambers, their voices weaving layers of protection and guidance around the forming beings. The silence that followed felt dense, as though the entire divine assembly held its breath while the new life settled into its hidden transformation. Days passed, or perhaps ages, for the texts speak in a language where time feels fluid. Within the sealed spaces, the clay began to change. The mixture of earth and divine blood shifted towards something living, the kind of shift that eludes concrete explanation. When the chambers finally opened, the first humans emerged, their eyes blinking against the faint light of the goddess's workshop. They breathed softly at first, their movements tentative, newborn in every sense, yet carrying an intelligence that flickered behind their gaze. The divine blood within them stirred awareness that clay alone could never hold. They were fragile but conscious, capable of understanding more than their creators anticipated. Ninhursag looked upon them with a mix of pride and solemnity, knowing that these beings, shaped by sacrifice and necessity, would bear the weight of creation's maintenance. The gods approached cautiously, studying the humans who now stood before them. They saw in their forms both the simplicity of earth and the subtle spark that made them capable of thought. Without ceremony, the humans were given their first tasks. They carried baskets filled with soil and stone, dug irrigation channels, and tended the growing cities and temples fashioned for divine use. Their hands moved with purpose, their minds absorbing instructions quickly, as though the intelligence embedded in their blood guided their every step. There was a sad beauty in the scene, beings crafted with divine essence, yet destined for labour from the moment they opened their eyes. They worked quietly, unaware that their creation marked the beginning of a story that would stretch far beyond the gods' intentions. For now, the workshop fell silent again, as Ninhursag watched her creations blend into the rhythms of the world. The first humans were complete. But they were not the end of the story, they were only the beginning. The gods had made a mistake. They had given us too much. The first humans stepped into the world with quiet obedience, carrying baskets and tending the earth as the gods intended. But their numbers grew quickly, spreading across the river valleys and filling the fields with constant motion. Their voices, once faint murmurs, rose into a steady roar as villages expanded and families multiplied. The ancient texts describe this rising energy in vivid terms, saying the land shook with the uproar of mankind, a sound that rolled across the plains like the bellow of a restless bull. The gods, who had once sought relief, now found themselves overwhelmed by the very beings they'd shaped. Enlil felt the disturbance more than any other god, for the noise rose into the air he governed, rattling the winds that carried his authority across the young world. Whenever he tried to rest, the clamour of humanity surged around him, a relentless reminder of a decision he now viewed with regret. The tablets portray him pacing, agitated, unable to escape the voices echoing through valleys and cities. For him, creation had tipped into imbalance, and silence, once taken for granted, became a rare and distant memory he longed to reclaim. Its absence weighed on him, he could not set down. In the councils that followed, Enlil pressed for action, insisting that humanity's growth threatened the stability of the cosmos. The first measure proposed was disease, a quiet agent meant to thin the population without the violence of divine intervention. Illness spread, But Enki intervened, whispering cures into the dreams of healers, guiding them to herbs and rituals that eased the suffering. Humanity endured. Enlil's frustration deepened, his patience thinning as quickly as the rivers in a drought. He warned the assembly that stronger measures were needed, for the uproar of mankind only grew louder with every passing season now. When disease failed, Enlil turned to drought, withdrawing rains from the fields where humanity struggled to survive. Crops withered under the sun's relentless heat, and rivers shrank to narrow threads cutting through cracked earth. Yet again Enki intervened, teaching people how to dig deeper wells, how to redirect what little water remained, how to stretch their resources through cooperation. His quiet rebellion kept humanity alive, even as the divide between the two gods widened. Enlil grew convinced that his fellow deities' compassion endangered the delicate order they had tried to establish after the world's violent birth, and he feared. Enlil then proposed famine, reasoning that hunger would accomplish what drought and disease had not. Food vanished from the granaries as blight swept across fields, the stalks collapsing before harvest. Yet Enki again found ways to guide humanity through the hardship, teaching them to gather wild grains, to store what little they could salvage, to hunt in the hills where animals still roamed. His actions angered Enlil, who saw each intervention as defiance. What had begun as irritation hardened into something darker, a determination to silence the voices that filled the world with ceaseless noise that would not fade. The divine assembly gathered once more, tension hanging between the gods like a heavy mist. Enlil argued that the lesser measures had failed, and that only a decisive act could restore the quiet he desired. His voice carried authority as he reminded them of the original purpose behind humanity's creation: labor, not proliferation. The others listened in uneasy silence, aware that the problem had grown beyond simple remedies. Enki spoke cautiously, urging patience, but his words found little support. The divide between preservation and destruction had widened so far that compromise felt impossible for any of them now ever. Enlil's final decision emerged with a cold clarity that startled even those who supported stricter action. He declared that humanity must be erased entirely, not through subtle means but through an overwhelming event that none could escape. The tablets hinted a pause, as though the gods recognized the gravity of what he proposed. Yet no one challenged him openly. The uproar of mankind had grown too loud, and the burden of their existence seemed too heavy for the divine order to bear. Silence, Enlil believed, could be restored only by sweeping the world clean in a single stroke. The flood approached. The night around Atrahasis felt unusually still, as if the world were holding its breath while he lingered beside the quiet reed house that had sheltered generations before him. A faint shimmer drifted through the air, a presence he sensed before he fully understood, and he found himself listening to the soft murmur of water beyond the fields as though it carried a secret meant only for him. On the other side of the wall, something shifted, neither wind nor creature, but a deliberate arrival that made the structure tremble with a subtle, uncanny life. He knew the gods were restless. Everyone did. For months, the signs had grown harder to ignore, yet no proclamation had come from the divine assembly. Instead, the world felt strained, too full, too loud, its people unaware that their voices had become the complaint echoing beyond the heavens. Atrahasis tried to quiet his own mind, yet a low unease pressed against him, urging him to remain where he stood, as if waiting for a message that was not meant to be spoken to him directly. Then the whisper came. It threaded through the reeds like a breath drawn from ancient depths, forming words so careful and precise that the wall itself seemed to lean forward to receive them. Enki, the one known for wisdom and subtle counsel, spoke softly, his vow binding him against a direct warning, yet his compassion reaching for a path that skirted the edges of divine law. "Reed wall," he murmured, addressing the structure instead of the man mere steps away. "Listen and remember. A great water is coming, and all that stands will be washed clean." Atrahasis felt the words settle into him, even though he stood in silence. He understood the strange balance being maintained, the illusion of obedience preserved by speaking to wood and fibre rather than to him. The instruction continued. Tear down the house, gather the materials, shape them into a vessel vast enough to carry life through the ruin that was approaching. Seal it tight, stronger than any dwelling, for the waters would rise higher than memory, higher than the highest fields and the oldest cities. The enormity of it pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. He did not think of righteousness, for no such claim had been made. The gods had not condemned humanity for wickedness. They simply wished for quiet, for a world less swollen with people, for nights unbroken by constant noise. It was a chilling clarity. The flood was not judgment. It was adjustment, a reset to restore balance in ways mortals were never meant to understand. Atrahasis realized that he had been chosen not for purity but for his perception, for the way he listened to currents beneath the surface of ordinary life. As he absorbed Enki's cryptic guidance, the weight of secrecy settled over him. He would have to build the vessel without revealing its purpose. Every board he cut, every measure of pitch he heated, every animal he gathered would echo with the knowledge that countless others would never see the rising sun again once the waters arrived. Faces he had known since childhood flickered through his thoughts, yet he could tell no one. The silence demanded of him mirrored the silence the gods longed to reclaim. Night after night he worked, shaping timbers beneath veiled skies, acting as though he were repairing old structures or storing grain for an ordinary season. Only the wall that had heard the divine whisper knew the truth. And each time he returned to that quiet place, he felt again the faint trace of a presence lingering there, a reminder that the god who had found a loophole was still watching, still guiding, still hoping that this fragile effort might carry life forward into a future washed clean of noise. When the vessel at last rose from the earth in its strange, massive form, Atrahasis paused to take in what he had built. It looked out of place against the fields, like a dream resting on soil. Yet he felt no pride, only a solemn acceptance. Soon he would gather his family, the seeds of their world. The first drops arrived without warning, tapping softly against the sealed roof of the vessel, as if the sky were testing its own resolve. Atrahasis felt each one like a distant heartbeat, slow and deliberate. Then the rhythm quickened, swelling into a restless hiss that spread across the horizon. Darkness rolled in behind the gathering rain, thick and heavy, and the air carried an uneasy vibration, as though the world itself sensed the moment before breaking. Once the heavens opened fully, the sky unleashed more than rain. Storm winds tore across the land with a force that bent trees into the ground. Lightning stitched the clouds into a single blazing sheet, and thunder cracked so violently that Atrahasis could feel it through the boards of the boat. Each strike seemed to peel away another layer of the familiar world, replacing it with raw, chaotic power. Beneath the storm, the earth itself trembled. Waves of trembling soil rolled beneath distant cities, sending walls stumbling into dust. Winds spiraled into towering columns that pulled roofs into the sky. Atrahasis imagined the people outside, voices lost beneath the roar, running toward high ground that no longer existed. Nothing in the stories of his ancestors had prepared him for a night when land and sky seemed determined to undo all that lived between them. Inside the sealed vessel, darkness pressed against Atrahasis and his family like a second skin. The small oil lamp flickered constantly, sensitive to every shudder of the boat. Children whispered in uncertainty, trying to understand why the world outside had turned hostile. No one slept. They listened instead, counting the endless collisions of water and wind, feeling each surge lift the vessel into a realm where direction no longer had meaning. Far above the storm-churned world, the divine assembly faced the consequences of their own command. The ancient texts described the gods recoiling from the violence, pressed against the walls of heaven as the waters swallowed fields, homes, and temples. They had wished for silence, yet the magnitude of destruction exceeded everything they had imagined. Fear crept into their ranks, spreading faster than the flood itself, leaving even the boldest among them shaken and uncertain. Among the frightened deities, Ninhursag grieved the most. She had shaped humanity with patient intention, hoping they would fill the earth with vitality. Now she watched the rivers darken with countless bodies, and her cries echoed through the heavens. Her sorrow carried a raw truth. Creation had been undone not by human failure, but by a divine decision that overwhelmed even those who had issued it. Days passed, though the darkness made it impossible to measure time in any familiar way. Atrahasis kept his hands on the vessel's wooden frame, feeling the tremors of distant collapses and the unpredictable heaving of the water. 7 nights of relentless storm blurred into one unbroken ordeal. Each moment brought the same question. Would the vessel hold, or would the flood claim them as it had claimed everything else beneath the rising sea? When the storm finally broke, the silence arrived so abruptly that Atrahasis wondered whether his ears had failed. The vessel drifted without resistance, gliding across a world stripped of shape and colour. Hours later, he felt the faint scrape of wood against stone. The boat had come to rest upon a mountain, anchored by forces he could not see. Hope flickered through the exhaustion, though it carried an ache that felt almost too heavy to bear. To understand whether the world had begun to dry, Atrahasis released a dove into the washed air. It returned with empty wings. A swallow followed, circling once before returning as well. Only the raven, dark and observant, vanished into the open sky and did not come back, a silent sign that the waters had finally begun to withdraw. Only then did Atrahasis lift the heavy seal from the door and let the first breath of the altered world reach him. The landscape below was silent, a plain of mud and remnants where cities once stood. Relief touched him, but so did grief, for the cost of survival surrounded him. Yet this emptiness marked the beginning of whatever would come next. When the waters finally retreated and the trembling earth grew quiet, Atrahasis stepped onto ground that felt both familiar and transformed. The world around him was stripped of echoes, stripped of every ordinary sound that once defined human life. It was as though creation itself held its breath, waiting for a spark to remind it how to move again. Slowly, with hands still shaking from the long isolation within the boat, he gathered stones and built an altar. He lit a fire, and the first thread of smoke rose into the pale sky, carrying the warm scent of roasted meat through a world that had forgotten such smells. For a moment he stood alone with the offering, unsure if any divine ear remained to hear him. But the silence did not last. The gods came. They did not descend in majesty or thunder. They came driven by hunger. The old texts say they gathered like flies around the offering, drawn by the smell as though it were the first warmth of spring after a merciless winter. For years they had gone without devotion, without incense, without the quiet rhythm of gifts that humans once laid before them. They had drowned the world to silence it, but in doing so they had silenced the very flow of sustenance that kept them anchored in power. Now, with the scent of sacrifice rising into the empty air, they swarmed around it with a longing that stripped them of dignity. It was a humbling sight, even in the imagination. The gods who commanded storms and shaped destinies reduced to longing for the scent of cooked meat. Their vast power remained, but hunger had carved cracks through their composure, revealing how deeply their existence was tied to the creatures they had nearly erased. In that moment, the boundary between mortal and divine thinned, leaving only a simple truth. The gods needed humanity. Then Enlil arrived, furious. His authority, once unshaken, now trembled beneath the undeniable fact that a human had survived his flood. His plan had been absolute, a cleansing meant to rid the world of noise and burden. Yet here stood Atrahasis, alive, offering gratitude to the sky. Enlil demanded to know who had betrayed the divine decree, who had whispered escape into human ears. His rage filled the assembly like a storm cloud refusing to break. The other gods shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of how quickly they had rushed toward the altar's smoke. Others exchanged wary glances, knowing full well that Enlil's wrath could not erase what hunger had revealed. They had suffered without humans. They had weakened. They could not pretend otherwise. Ninhursag, the mother of life, spoke with a steady voice. She reminded them that humanity was not a nuisance, but part of the balance they all depended on. Without people, temples would crumble, altars would darken, and the sustaining cycle between heaven and earth would fall apart. Enki stepped forward beside her, admitting that he had saved Atrahasis. Not from rebellion, but from necessity. The gods needed humans to survive. The admission settled over the gathering like a quiet, unavoidably honest verdict. And so a compromise formed. Humanity would return, but not without boundaries. Some women would be barren. Some children would not live long enough to grow. Human lifespan would shorten, ensuring that the world would never again swell beyond what the gods believed they could manage. Mortality, in this ancient telling, was not a punishment for sin. It was population control, built into the very fabric of human existence by gods who feared the world growing crowded once more. It was a somber agreement, shaped not by moral judgment, but by practicality. The gods were not perfect beings dispensing justice. They were weary caretakers trying to maintain balance while carrying their own flaws. Suffering and death were tools, not sentences, meant to keep the world steady. As the last threads of smoke drifted upward, the gods accepted their own dependence and the fragile peace they had forged. And from the quiet aftermath of the flood, humanity stepped forward again, limited, mortal, yet carrying something that had survived the waters, the knowledge the gods had once shared. Wisdom that would guide the first cities, shape early stories, and lay the foundations of civilization for ages. Long before the flood reshaped the world into silence, the Sumerians believed that mysterious beings rose from the sea, carrying with them the first sparks of civilization. These were the Apkallu, the seven sages, emissaries of Enki who walked between mortal and divine. They were described as part human, part fish, emerging from the deep like quiet messengers of another realm. Each carried knowledge that no human mind had yet imagined: writing, mathematics, astronomy, the careful observation of seasons, the secrets of planting, and the early logic of law. They moved from city to city, establishing the fragile framework that would one day support the first great cultures. To the ancient storytellers, the gifts they brought were not inventions but revelations, hints of a wisdom that originated beyond human effort. Among these figures, none was more revered than Adapa, the first sage, described as a man who possessed broad understanding and insight granted directly from Enki. Adapa was said to have known the patterns of heaven, the movements of stars, and the subtleties of language long before scribes etched symbols into clay. Legends portray him as a quiet, contemplative figure, one who carried the burden of knowledge with a seriousness that set him apart from ordinary humans. Through him, the earliest concepts of order and structure entered human life. He was not merely a teacher but a threshold, a point where divine intention met human potential. And behind him, guiding every lesson, stood Enki, whose domain was not only the sea, but the vast currents of wisdom flowing beneath creation. The sages travelled through early settlements that were little more than clusters of reed huts and scattered fires, yet everywhere they went, something changed. They introduced the me, those profound decrees that shaped not just skills but the very structure of society. The me defined kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, truth, law, music, architecture, and even the intimate instincts that guided families and desire. According to the old tablets, Enki held all these principles in his possession like treasures, releasing them only when he judged humanity ready to bear their weight. To the listeners gathered around temple courtyards, the arrival of a sage must have felt like witnessing a door open to a larger world. Their teachings did not force advancement, they simply awakened what lay dormant, allowing human hands to shape futures they had never imagined. But with every revelation came a shadow. The sages were selective, guarding certain truths behind metaphor and ritual. Some knowledge, they said, belonged only to the gods or to those who carried divine sanction. The tablets hint at teachings that were spoken but never written, or written but sealed away in temple vaults where only the highest initiates could read them. What kind of knowledge required such caution? Some myths suggest it concerned the true origins of kingship, others the hidden nature of the divine hosts themselves. There are whispers of technologies or arts that blurred the line between human capability and divine power. Whatever these secrets were, they carried weight. The sages knew that knowledge could elevate, but it could also unravel, and so they guarded the boundaries carefully. And so the world before the flood became a landscape shaped not just by human effort, but by guidance from beings who moved between realms. The Apkallu offered the tools needed to build the earliest cities, but they also reminded humanity that wisdom carried responsibility. Their presence suggested that civilization was not an accident of evolution, but part of a larger design, one threaded with intention and restraint. Stories of these sages lingered long after they vanished, preserved in clay tablets that outlasted empires. They left behind a question that still unsettles the imagination. If they gave us the foundations of knowledge, what exactly did they choose to withhold? And why were some truths considered too potent for human hands? Such mysteries endure, quietly shaping our curiosity. The Sumerians looked at the sky with a sense of order, as though they recognized patterns woven into the darkness long before anyone else learned to read them. Their cities were young, their tools simple, yet their understanding of numbers and stars was astonishingly mature. They created a number system unlike anything used today, base 60, the sexagesimal system. It seems odd at first, an eccentric choice from a distant age, but the more one looks at it, the more elegant it becomes. 60 divides cleanly into so many parts: halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths. It is a number that invites harmony, especially when mapping cycles, angles, and celestial movements. Even now, we count minutes and seconds by their system, still turning circles through 360 degrees because of decisions made on the banks of the Euphrates thousands of years ago. It makes one wonder how such mathematical intuition emerged so suddenly, so fully formed. Their tablets contain tables of squares, cubes, reciprocals, tools that suggest not only curiosity, but a deep, structured approach to solving problems. These were not the casual scribblings of a society just beginning to experiment with numbers. They reflect minds trained to see the world through proportion and rhythm. According to the myths, this training came from the gods, particularly from Enki and the Apkallu, who carried the me of mathematics and cosmic order. In their telling, numbers were not invented by humans but revealed part of the architecture of reality that had always existed. Their astronomy was equally remarkable. They tracked the planets with a steadiness that suggests long, careful observation. They understood the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes, marking the turning points of the year with a precision confirmed by later civilizations. They divided the sky into 12 great segments, each associated with constellations that still form the backbone of the zodiac. The year became 12 months, the day 12 double hours, as if everything in their lives was meant to echo the celestial structure they saw above them. It is striking how complete this framework was, how ready to be inherited by every culture that followed. Some claim the Sumerians knew about planets invisible to the naked eye, though such claims remain debated. Still, the detail in their astronomical records raises questions. How did a civilization so early in human history measure the heavens with methods that still impress modern scholars? Their explanations pointed upward to divine tutors, to beings who understood the hidden order of the cosmos and decided to share it. Whether one takes the stories literally or symbolically, the idea remains intriguing. Knowledge arriving not gradually, but in a sudden, luminous burst. More enigmatic still was their understanding of time. For the Sumerians, time was not a straight line but a vast cycle, an endless turning of creation and destruction. They measured cosmic ages with units called sars, ners, and soses, thousands of years sliding past like seasons in a much larger calendar. In this view, the world had begun many times before, and would begin again after the inevitable collapse of each era. Humanity existed within one cycle among countless others, with floods and fires acting as the punctuation marks between epochs. This cyclical imagination suggests memories real or symbolic of previous ages, earlier civilizations, or worlds lost to disaster. Such ideas cast their scientific achievements in a different light. Their mathematics, their astronomy, their sense of time all hint at a worldview that saw patterns repeating over unimaginable spans. They saw the heavens not as a distant mystery, but as a map of past and future events. When they calculated the paths of stars, they believed they were glimpsing the underlying rhythm of existence. And at the center of that rhythm stood Enki and the sages, guiding human understanding with deliberate care, offering enough wisdom to build, but keeping certain truths just beyond reach. The tablets leave us with an unsettling question. If the Sumerians received knowledge from divine teachers, what else might those teachers have revealed about themselves, about the universe, about the forces shaping creation? And it is at this point, where numbers and stars begin to blur into myth, that the stories take a far stranger turn. The Sumerians imagined the universe not as a simple dome arched over the earth, but as a layered structure, a kind of cosmic architecture in which every realm had its place, its guardians, and its hidden thresholds. At the highest level was An, the realm of the gods, often described as stretching across multiple layers of heaven. Beneath it lay Ki, the world of humans, a flat expanse resting on the Abzu, the freshwater deep where Enki kept his palace. And beneath that, sealed away in eternal dusk, lay Kur, the underworld, a shadowed land ruled by Ereshkigal, where the dead drifted like faint echoes of themselves. These realms were not metaphorical to the Sumerians. They treated them as structured spaces, as real as the brick temples rising from their cities. In some texts, the heavens are divided into 7 tiers, each governed by different divine powers. The gods did not simply wander through an undefined sky. They occupied specific courts, chambers, and regions that mirrored the organized rituals of temple life on Earth. Even the stars were positioned with an almost architectural precision, forming patterns that echoed the divine hierarchy above. Ki, the middle realm, floated on the Abzu like a raft on boundless water. The Abzu itself was both physical and mystical, a reservoir feeding rivers and wells, and also a passageway to hidden knowledge. Enki, Lord of Wisdom, ruled from this depth, sending forth the Apkallu, his emissaries, whenever humanity needed direction. To the Sumerians, the world was supported not by imagination, but by layers of reality stacked like the steps of their ziggurats. Kur, the lowest realm, was far from the fiery hells imagined by later cultures. Instead, it was a dim reflection of the living world, stripped of colour and vitality. The dead there were not tormented, but they were hungry, thirsty, and restless, depending on offerings from the living to maintain even the faintest form. Ereshkigal's rule was absolute, and her realm was bound by gates, each guarded and sealed, each allowing passage only at a cost. No story captures this structure more vividly than the descent of Inanna. The goddess, radiant in her power, chose to enter the underworld, seeking to confront her sister, or perhaps to test the boundaries between life and death. As she approached Kur, she passed through 7 gates. At each gate, a portion of her divinity was taken, her crown, her jewelry, her garments, symbols of authority stripped away one by one. By the time she reached Ereshkigal's throne, she stood naked and powerless, a reminder that no being could cross realms without paying the toll demanded by cosmic law. This journey has long been interpreted as a cycle of death and rebirth. Yet its details suggest more than symbolic poetry. The gates, the guardians, the precise order of removal. These read like elements of a map, an instruction for navigating the unseen. It is as though the Sumerians believed the pathways between realms could be charted, understood, even traversed by those with the right knowledge. Their world was not divided by impenetrable barriers, but by thresholds requiring courage, understanding, and sacrifice. The concept of the me reinforces this sense of a structured cosmos. These divine decrees were not abstract virtues. They were treated as tangible objects, capable of being carried, stolen, hidden, or bestowed. Kingship, wisdom, truth, craftsmanship, even the art of seduction or the strategy of warfare, all were me. When Inanna once stole the me from Enki in a daring mythic tale, she fled with them aboard her boat as though escaping with sacred artifacts. Power, in this worldview, was something that could physically change hands. Such stories hint at a deeper understanding. Knowledge itself had weight, presence, and boundaries. It could be protected or guarded like treasure. This idea extended into the physical world. Many tablets describe hidden chambers within ziggurats, where sacred objects and texts were stored, accessible only to priests who had undergone demanding rituals. Were these archives of clay tablets, or ritual spaces intended to mirror the cosmic levels above and below? The distinction may not have mattered to those who built them. To the Sumerians, the cosmos was a system of realms, held together by pathways both visible and unseen, and those who understood this structure could move closer to the mysteries that shaped existence. This knowledge was preserved, protected, and guarded across generations. But it was not merely philosophical. It was functional, practical, and, according to some, capable of opening contact with other realms. And the methods they used are still debated today. The ziggurat rose from the plain like a tiered mountain carved by deliberate hands, its bricks still warm with the memory of the sun. To the people of ancient Sumer, these structures were not simply buildings but bridges, immense stairways connecting Earth to the realms above. Each tier climbed toward the sky in sharp, geometric steps, narrowing as it ascended until a shrine, small and gleaming, crowned the summit. From a distance, the ziggurats seemed to lift the horizon itself, turning clay and bitumen into something that touched the divine. Yet beneath their imposing simplicity lay a deeper complexity, a network of chambers, corridors, and carefully aligned spaces that suggest these structures served purposes more intricate than prayer alone. Mainstream archaeology describes the ziggurat as a temple platform, a raised foundation that elevated priests closer to the heavens. The shrine at the top housed the god's presence, and rituals enacted there renewed the bond between mortals and the divine. But when one examines the architectural details, the picture becomes more intriguing. Many ziggurats contain internal rooms whose functions remain unclear, arranged in patterns that seem calculated rather than decorative. Some align with solstices or particular stars, as though they were built to register celestial rhythms. Others include remnants of channels running beneath or through the structure, hinting at controlled movement of water, an element closely tied to Enki and his domain of knowledge. Water in Sumerian cosmology was more than a resource. It was a medium of creation, a carrier of power, and a symbol of the Abzu, the hidden deep that sustained both gods and humans. The presence of water channels within ziggurats raises questions. Were they simply methods for stabilizing massive mud brick cores? Or did they play a role in ritual processes involving sound, vibration, or purification? Some researchers propose that flowing water could generate resonance within enclosed chambers, producing tones or echoes that might have enhanced ceremonial experiences. The idea is speculative, yet it fits the broader pattern. Ziggurats were built not only to be seen, but to be used. Their precision is equally striking. The great ziggurat of Ur was oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions, its corners aligned with mathematical care. The White Temple at Uruk stood upon a platform positioned to catch the rising light of specific stars. And Etemenanki, the vast ziggurat of Babylon, possibly the inspiration for the Tower of Babel, was described as a structure linking heaven and earth through a central axis, a kind of cosmic anchor. Such accuracy implies deliberate planning, a grasp of geometry and astronomy far beyond what one might expect from a world so early in its technological timeline. It invites the question: were the ziggurats designed as observatories, capable of tracking celestial events from elevated vantage points? Or were they built to receive something, perhaps even someone, descending from the sky? Sumerian texts supported the belief that these buildings were literal houses of the gods. Their names reveal this: Ekur, the house of the mountain; Esagila, the house of the raised head. These were not metaphors. The gods were thought to dwell within these places, resting, commanding, and interacting with chosen priests. If the gods were physical beings rather than distant abstractions, could the ziggurats have been constructed as their earthly residences? The step design resembles platforms or stages, places where descent and ascent were choreographed. Some alternative theorists see in these structures an echo of technology grounds for arrival, centers of operation, or even early communication towers designed to interface with forces beyond human understanding. While such interpretations stretch beyond what the tablets explicitly state, the mystery remains compelling. Ziggurats do not behave like simple temples. They act like instruments carefully tuned, oriented, and layered. It is possible they embodied both aspects: sacred spaces that were also functional devices, machines in the sense that they mediated power, knowledge, and connection between realms. If the ziggurats truly operated as machines, one must ask, what powered them? What energies or forces did the ancients harness within those towering walls? The answer might lie in the rituals performed inside them, rituals involving sound, light, and substances capable of altering perception and opening hidden doors. Inside the temples of ancient Sumer, the air was thick with incense and quiet expectation, as though something unseen waited just beyond the senses. Rituals performed within those walls were not meant for ordinary worship. They were designed to shift consciousness, to open doors between realms. The tablets describe offerings of beer, wine, oils, and carefully prepared plants not merely as gifts to the gods, but as tools used by priests seeking communion. These were substances crafted with precision, meant to guide the mind into altered states where divine contact became possible. The Sumerians were master brewers, inventors of beer long before it became an everyday drink. Yet within the temple, beer took on a different purpose. Thick, sweet, and sometimes infused with herbs, it formed part of initiation rites. Date wine, too, carried symbolic weight, extracted from groves cultivated with almost ceremonial care. Some researchers believe certain plants native to the region now overshadowed by time may have had psychoactive effects when prepared in specific ways. While evidence is indirect, the hints woven through temple inscriptions suggest a deliberate exploration of the mind's hidden thresholds. Priests did not walk this path alone. The On and Entu priestesses, embodiments of Inanna's sacred authority, participated in rituals that intertwined physical intimacy with spiritual ascent. These acts, misunderstood by later cultures, were not seen as profane but as conduits for divine energy. To the Sumerians, sacred sexuality was a technology, a controlled method for harmonizing human and divine frequencies. Through ritual union, the boundary between mortal and God softened, allowing messages, visions, or insights to flow more freely into human awareness. Deep within temple complexes lay inner sanctums, where only the fully initiated could enter. These silent chambers were designed to isolate the senses, allowing priests to prepare themselves through fasting, intentional breathing, and long hours of chanting. The Sumerians believed that sound shaped reality. Certain tones and rhythms could attune the mind to subtler dimensions. Repetitive hymns, accompanied by drums or flutes, created vibrations that guided the practitioner into trance. Within this state, priests recorded experiencing visions of luminous beings, distant realms, and symbolic messages whose interpretations shaped rituals for generations. Such experiences were not considered fantasy. They were understood as genuine journeys into unseen territories. In many cultures, altered states formed the backbone of spiritual insight. The Greek mysteries used potions and theatrical darkness. Egyptian initiates trained to navigate dreamlike realms. Shamans worldwide relied on plants and rhythm to cross invisible thresholds. The Sumerians belonged to this same lineage, though their practices were among the earliest documented. Their tablets describe priests ascending into the heavens or descending into shadowed landscapes, encountering figures who revealed secrets of fate, cosmic cycles, or the hidden workings of life. Mainstream scholarship often dismisses these passages as myth or poetic exaggeration, yet the consistency of such descriptions, found across centuries of Sumerian writing, suggests more than metaphor. When priests spoke of conversations with gods, were they recounting symbolic experiences, or were they describing profound states of consciousness where information surfaced from depths modern culture barely understands? Some interpret these visions as the mind accessing its own buried knowledge. Others suggest that altered states open channels to something beyond the human psyche, non-physical entities, archetypal realms, or dimensions the Sumerians mapped through ritual. What makes these accounts so compelling is the confidence with which the Sumerians treated them. They built entire ritual calendars, priestly hierarchies, and temple architectures around the assumption that consciousness could travel, perceive, and return with messages of value. Their visions shaped political decisions, agricultural planning, and even the interpretation of celestial movements. To them, altered states were not escapes from reality, but gateways into deeper layers of it, layers where gods spoke, symbols came alive, and hidden truths shimmered just beyond ordinary sight. Yet, even within this sophisticated spiritual system, not all knowledge was shared. Some rituals were restricted to the highest ranks, protected by codes that blended myth with secrecy. Their teachings were whispered, not written, and when they appeared in stories, they were wrapped in symbols meant only for trained minds to decode. And many of these hidden teachings circled around a single, unsettling theme: knowledge about us, our origins, our nature, and the purpose for which humanity was shaped. In the oldest Sumerian stories, humans are described as servants, shaped to ease the burdens of the gods. Yet the myths contain a quieter, deeper suggestion. Though fashioned for labor, we were made from divine material clay, mixed with the blood of a god who carried intelligence, memory, and purpose. That detail lingers like a whisper. If divine essence resides within us, then humanity was never merely a workforce, but a lineage of beings holding dormant potential. The boundary between mortal and divine was not a wall, but a veil thin enough to be crossed. Stories scattered across clay tablets hint at this hidden possibility. Ziusudra, the flood survivor, was granted immortality and carried to dwell among the divine hosts, no longer bound by human limitations. Adapa, the first sage, received wisdom so profound that even some gods regarded him with caution. Gilgamesh, though denied eternal life, achieved another form of transcendence through unending remembrance. These accounts suggest that transformation was attainable, that humanity possessed the seeds of divinity waiting to be awakened. and that the gods themselves recognized the porous line separating human striving from celestial stature. Behind temple walls, select initiates underwent trainings meant to activate this buried spark. These mystery traditions were subtle, woven into rituals of fasting, sound, breath, and contemplation. Priests taught that the me, those divine powers governing everything from wisdom to kingship, did not only exist in heaven or in sacred objects, but also within the human soul. Through disciplined practice, initiates learned to align their inner world with the cosmic order, awakening capacities that ordinary people never touched. It was a path of remembrance, returning to something humanity once possessed before fear, hierarchy, and forgetfulness dimmed our awareness of it. This hidden doctrine echoed through later civilizations. Gnostic teachers spoke of a divine spark trapped within the human frame, waiting for knowledge to ignite it. Hermetic philosophers taught that whatever existed above also existed below, implying that human consciousness mirrored cosmic mind. These parallels suggest that Sumerian initiation schools carried an early version of a timeless idea, that humans were not designed to remain small. Instead, they were beings capable of immense insight, limited only by the stories they accepted about themselves. The gods may have created humanity for service, but the myths imply they also feared what fully awakened humans might become. Power structures, both human and divine, had incentives to bury this truth. A population aware of its inner divinity would be difficult to command. Priests, kings, and even the gods in the stories required obedience to maintain their order. And so the doctrine of human potential was veiled behind symbols, encoded in myths, and reserved for those deemed capable of bearing it responsibly. Over generations, as empires rose and fell, the deeper message faded. What remained were fragments, stories of heroes touching the divine, rites hinting at forgotten abilities, and faint reminders that humanity once stood closer to the gods than we imagine. And yet the old question still rises from those broken tablets and whispered traditions. What if the Sumerians understood something essential about human nature that later ages overlooked? What if our limitations are learned, not inherent, the result of forgetting rather than lack? If divine essence truly runs through us, then we may walk the world carrying powers we were never taught to recognize. The hidden doctrine suggests that humanity is not fallen but unfinished, a being capable of awakening to forgotten abilities. And perhaps the greatest secret the Sumerians preserved is simply this: we are more than we remember. Maybe the gods always intended humans to rediscover their inheritance. When Sumer faded from the forefront of history, its stories did not disappear. Instead, they flowed into the rising empires around it, carried by scribes, merchants, conquerors, and kings who recognized the value of what the Sumerians had built. When the Akkadians swept through the land around 2300 BCE, they absorbed more than territory. They inherited a worldview. Rather than erasing Sumerian culture, they adopted it, writing their own language in cuneiform and retaining Sumerian myths as the backbone of their religious life. Akkadian kings claimed legitimacy by linking themselves to earlier Sumerian rulers, as though authority required a root in that older, deeper civilization. Babylon and Assyria followed this pattern. Their priests carefully copied Sumerian tablets, often preserving them in bilingual format, Sumerian on one line, Akkadian on the next. These were not dusty archives, but living texts, used in rituals, royal ceremonies, and divination practices. As centuries passed, the stories were retold with subtle shifts. New gods rose to prominence, old gods were given new titles, and myths were tailored to fit political needs. Yet the core remained unmistakably Sumerian. Even when new names dominated, the ancient patterns lingered beneath the surface like the foundation stones of a temple rebuilt many times. One of the clearest examples is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Though celebrated as Babylon's national myth, its bones are Sumerian primordial waters, battling forces, cosmic order emerging from conflict. What changed was the elevation of Marduk. Babylon wanted its patron deity to rule the cosmos, so Marduk became the hero who defeated chaos and established creation. It was a political revision, a city asserting its power through theology. But the shape of the story, the structure of the cosmos, the rhythm of creation, all echoed older Sumerian ideas. The flood narrative followed a similar journey. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim recounts the Great Deluge, almost exactly as Atrahasis experienced it in earlier Sumerian texts. The gods debate humanity's fate, a chosen man builds a boat, animals are saved, and the world begins again. Details shift, names change, motivations adjust, but the narrative core remains. Gilgamesh himself, though shaped into a Babylonian hero, draws on older traditions of semi-divine kings whose destinies brushed against the realm of the gods. Through these stories, Sumerian wisdom travelled far beyond its original cities. As trade routes expanded and empires clashed, these tales seeped into neighbouring cultures. The Canaanites adopted elements of Mesopotamian cosmology. The Phoenicians carried fragments of the myths across the Mediterranean. The Hittites borrowed entire stories, retelling them with their own deities. Early Greek thinkers encountered Mesopotamian ideas through trade and diplomacy, incorporating echoes of the flood, the descent to the underworld, and the struggle between chaos and order. Everywhere the stories went, they shifted slightly, like a message whispered across generations. This process was not merely cultural diffusion, it was transformation. Each civilization adapted the stories to reflect its own anxieties, ambitions, and spiritual frameworks. Sometimes, political motives shaped the changes. Other times, local traditions merged with Mesopotamian themes to create new hybrids. What remains fascinating is how persistent the Sumerian foundation was. Even after names were altered, even after centuries blurred details, the essential structure, the cosmic order, the divine hierarchy, the origin tales endured. Tracing these movements is like following the roots of a vast tree back to a single seed. The challenge lies in separating original Sumerian material from later interpretation. Yet when we look beneath layers of translation and political editing, the ancient voices still speak. Their influence stretches across continents and centuries, shaping mythologies that many people assume emerged independently. And among the cultures that inherited these stories, one would reshape them more profoundly than any other: the ancient Hebrews. In that transformation, something vital was preserved, yet something equally crucial was lost. When we turn to the book of Genesis, we step into territory held sacred by millions. Yet history, archaeology, and textual comparison all point to a truth that does not diminish the biblical tradition, but reveals its deeper roots. The early chapters of Genesis echo far older stories from Sumer and Babylon. The Israelites encountered these myths long before the texts of the Hebrew Bible were finalized. In Canaan, they lived alongside cultures shaped by Mesopotamian ideas. Later, during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, the Hebrew elite walked among temples and libraries filled with cuneiform tablets, preserving creation epics, flood narratives, and cosmic genealogies. It is no mystery how these ideas found their way into the emerging biblical worldview. The parallels are striking. The Sumerian and Babylonian creation stories begin with watery chaos, embodied by Tiamat, whose name echoes the Hebrew Tehom, the deep. Humans are formed from earth mixed with divine substance, just as Adam is shaped from dust animated by God's breath. The paradise garden of Dilmun mirrors Eden, a flawless place where humans and deities once walked together. And the flood narrative follows an almost identical structure. The gods decide to wipe out corrupt humanity, warn a single righteous man, and instruct him to build a boat large enough to preserve life. After the waters recede, this survivor offers a sacrifice, and the divine realm regrets or revises its decision. Yet the differences reveal deliberate editing. The Sumerian world was polytheistic, filled with competing gods whose rivalries shaped creation. Genesis transforms this into a single, unified deity whose power requires no struggle, whose word alone establishes order. Where the older myths show gods creating humans as laborers to ease their burdens, Genesis elevates humanity to bear the image of the divine, replacing servitude with dignity. The intricate dramas of divine birth, conflict, and negotiation vanish, replaced by a calm sequence of creative acts. Even the flood is reframed. In Atrahasis, the deluge is about population control and cosmic management. In Genesis, it becomes a moral judgment, a response to human wickedness rather than divine inconvenience. These changes were not accidents. They reflect theological priorities shaped by historical trauma and cultural identity. The exiled Hebrews needed a worldview centered on a single, just God rather than a squabbling assembly of deities. They needed moral coherence, a sense of purpose, and a narrative that placed humanity within a covenant rather than a labor contract. But something was inevitably lost in the process. The strange details, the hints of ancient technology, the raw storytelling that felt almost observational rather than symbolic, these fragments were smoothed away. What remained was powerful and enduring, but far simpler than the mythic tapestry from which it emerged. The biblical writers were not hiding their influences, they were transforming them. They took the bones of Mesopotamian myth and reshaped them into a new theological vision. In doing so, they preserved the structure but altered the meaning. Creation became less about cosmic struggle and more about divine intention. Humanity became less an afterthought and more a centerpiece. The gods became God, and the ancient world's unsettling suggestions that humans were made from divine substance, that gods depended on offerings, that knowledge was transferred through secret rites, fell silent beneath the new narrative. This process of adaptation continued long after Genesis. The Sumerian stories spread into Greek myth, Gnostic writings, Hermetic philosophy, and even early Islamic thought, each culture editing and reframing the material to fit its own needs. By the time these stories reached the modern world, they had passed through countless hands, each leaving its mark. And in that long chain of transmission, layers of meaning were peeled away, leaving us with echoes rather than the full resonance of the original Sumerian voice. As Sumerian stories traveled through empires, religions, and languages, not everything survived the journey. Some ideas faded naturally, worn down by centuries of retelling. Others appear to have been filtered out deliberately too strange, too disruptive, or too incompatible with the new worldviews being constructed. When we look closely at what was preserved and what was discarded, a pattern emerges, suggesting that the earliest layers of human myth carried ideas later, traditions found uncomfortable, even dangerous. The first major loss came with the shift from polytheism to monotheism. The Sumerian universe was crowded, gods with personalities, rivalries, limitations, and distinct territories. As these stories moved into cultures that embraced a single supreme deity, the complex hierarchy of divine beings was flattened. Lesser gods were renamed as angels or demons. Deities associated with fertility, the moon, or storms became negative forces in later traditions, their once sacred roles reinterpreted through foreign theology. What had been a vibrant cosmic family became a simplified structure, pruning away nuances that hinted at a more complicated divine ecosystem. Equally significant was the erasure of the gods' humanity. In Sumer, divine beings ate, slept, quarreled, grew weary, and depended on human offerings to maintain their strength. They made mistakes and regretted decisions. But this view of divine imperfection posed problems for later religions that emphasized omnipotence and moral perfection. Over time, the fallible Sumerian gods were replaced with beings of absolute authority, their vulnerabilities edited out. This shift distanced the divine from the human, turning gods into unreachable ideals rather than beings operating on a continuum with humanity. The creation of humans underwent a similar transformation. In the Sumerian tablets, human origins are described almost like a biological experiment, mixing divine blood with clay, adjusting gestation periods, refining early prototypes. These details feel oddly technical, almost procedural, but when these stories reached later cultures, the specifics vanished. The creation of humanity became a mystical act, performed through divine speech or breath, stripped of the messy, material elements that once suggested a more hands-on process. What remained was poetry, not procedure. Another profound loss was the concept of cyclical time. The Sumerians believed the world had been created and destroyed multiple times, that civilizations rose and fell in immense cosmic rhythms. Catastrophic resets were part of the universe's design. But as their stories moved into cultures that favored linear narratives, a single creation, a single judgment, a single destiny, these cycles disappeared. The idea of previous humanities, previous ages, previous worlds, conflicted with emerging doctrines, and so the cycles were replaced with a straight line, beginning, middle, end. Perhaps the most sensitive layer of forgotten knowledge concerns the nature of humanity itself. The Sumerians implied that humans carried divine essence, that we were made not only to serve, but to potentially awaken. Their myths contain hints of transformation, ascension, and the unlocking of hidden abilities through discipline, ritual, and understanding. Later religious institutions, particularly in the Abrahamic traditions, grew wary of such ideas. Teachings that humans could become godlike or that divinity dwelled within threatened established hierarchies. Thus, these concepts were reframed as heresy. Yet they survived on the fringes among Gnostics, Hermeticists, Kabbalists, Sufis, whispered rather than proclaimed. So was this loss accidental, a natural evolution of stories shifting across cultures? Or was it intentional, guided by institutions that preferred obedient followers over empowered individuals? We cannot say with certainty. History rarely leaves us clear motives. But the pattern of what was preserved and what was cut away suggests that some ideas were simply too radical to fit within emerging religious and political structures. Still, the knowledge never vanished entirely. It slipped beneath the surface, hidden in symbols, myths, and secret teachings. And this leads to a final question. What exactly did the Sumerians know? And could any of it still be true? Across the ancient Near East, buried beneath layers of sand and collapsed cities, archaeologists have uncovered the closest thing we possess to direct messages from the Sumerian world. Thousands of clay tablets impressed with cuneiform signs. These tablets, scattered through sites in Iraq, Syria, and southeastern Turkey, form the backbone of everything we know about the earliest civilization on Earth. Some record grain deliveries, livestock inventories, and temple taxes. Others contain royal inscriptions, diplomatic letters, hymns, prayers, and the great mythological narratives that shaped the Sumerian worldview. These texts are real, tangible artifacts housed today in museums across the world: the British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and countless others. For more than a century and a half, scholars have been translating them, comparing versions, and reconstructing stories lost for thousands of years. This is the foundation, not speculation, not modern fantasy, but the literal record of how the Sumerians understood their world. Yet translating these tablets is anything but simple. Sumerian is a language isolate, unrelated to any known linguistic family, and its grammar often bends in ways that challenge modern expectations. Many tablets are broken, incomplete, or contextless, giving scholars only fragments to piece together through comparison with later Akkadian versions. Some texts were deliberately obscure, written in specialized jargon for priests, astronomers, or ritual practitioners who already knew the coded meanings. Despite these challenges, the broad outlines of Sumerian mythology are well established thanks to the work of pioneering scholars. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the most influential Assyriologists of the 20th century, spent decades cataloging, translating, and assembling Sumerian literature into coherent narratives. His efforts revealed a mythological corpus that had vanished from human memory. Creation stories, flood traditions, heroic epics, hymns of devotion, and laments mourning destroyed cities. Among the most significant texts is the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest written accounts of creation and the flood. It outlines the gods' decision to fashion humanity, the rise of early kings, and the catastrophic deluge that nearly ended human life. Complementing it is the Atrahasis epic, a more detailed story describing the divine rationale for creating humans, their growing numbers, and the series of crises that lead to the flood. From Babylon comes the Enuma Elish, a creation epic with deep Sumerian roots that reorganizes older myths to elevate the god Marduk. Then there is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's earliest literary masterpieces, preserving not only a hero's journey, but also the full flood narrative retold through the character Utnapishtim. Equally important is the Descent of Inanna, detailing the goddess's perilous journey through the 7 gates of the underworld in one of the most symbolic and enigmatic texts ever preserved. Surrounding these major works are hymns celebrating divine power, lamentations mourning fallen cities, proverbs expressing ancient wisdom, and ritual texts describing ceremonies meant to uphold cosmic order. Taken together, these tablets form a vivid picture of how the Sumerians viewed existence, a universe alive with gods, governed by decrees, and shaped by cycles of creation and destruction. And the wonder is this: anyone can read them. They sit in museums and are published in books and online archives, open to scholars, curious readers, and anyone willing to explore humanity's oldest recorded thoughts. These texts are not hidden, not speculative, not whispered through fringe theories. They are the literal writings of a civilization speaking across 5,000 years. And yet, even with all this knowledge, one mystery remains. Understanding what the Sumerians believed does not automatically reveal why they believed it, or what experiences inspired their extraordinary stories. That uncertainty is where interpretations begin to diverge. Some scholars see these stories as imaginative attempts to explain nature. Others argue they preserve memories of real events filtered through mythic imagery. Still others propose that the precision of certain descriptions hints at experiences or knowledge that defy easy categorization. Whatever the case, the surviving tablets give us the framework, but not the full explanation. They show us what the Sumerians wrote, but not the complete reality behind their words, leaving space for wonder, debate, and the search for deeper truths still hidden in the clay, waiting within for us to uncover. When we try to understand the Sumerian myths, we are not looking at a single, universally accepted interpretation. Instead, we encounter an entire spectrum of explanations, each shaped by different assumptions about human history, psychology, and the nature of reality itself. At one end lies the conservative academic view, at the other, a vision of the past filled with lost civilizations and non-human teachers. Between these poles stretches a landscape of ideas that reflect not only how we read ancient stories, but also how we see ourselves. The mainstream academic interpretation is the simplest and most familiar. In this view, myths are symbolic narratives created by early societies to explain natural forces, encode social norms, and express existential concerns. Thunder becomes a storm god, fertility becomes a mother goddess. Creation stories reflect early attempts to understand origins. Sumerian myths, therefore, are not historical accounts, but imaginative literature shaped by environmental pressures, political structures, and ritual life. They tell us about the culture that produced them, not about external beings or lost ages. This interpretation is grounded, cautious, and supported by linguistic and archaeological analysis. Yet critics argue it sometimes reduces myth to mere metaphor, underestimating the depth of ancient experience. A step further along the spectrum is the psychological or Jungian interpretation. Here, myths are neither literal histories nor random stories but expressions of the human psyche. The gods are archetypes. Inanna as the transformative feminine, Enki as the wise inner guide, Enlil as the stern authority. Floods symbolize psychic cleansing. Creation myths symbolize the emergence of consciousness from the unconscious. This framework treats myths with respect, seeing them as profound expressions of universal patterns that recur across cultures. The downside is that it tends to interpret everything inwardly, ignoring the possibility that myths might preserve memories of events outside the human mind. Next comes comparative mythology, a field shaped by thinkers like Joseph Campbell. Comparative scholars identify patterns shared across civilizations, dying and rising gods, heroic journeys, cosmic floods, primordial battles. These similarities may reflect diffusion stories, spreading through trade and conquest, or deeper structures of human thought, responding to similar conditions. This approach opens the door to historical questions. If flood myths appear everywhere, did they arise independently, or do they preserve a distant memory of an actual cataclysm? If gods teach humanity, agriculture, and astronomy in multiple traditions, is that coincidence, parallel invention, or something stranger? Comparative mythology does not claim definitive answers, but it allows myths to hint at real events filtered through cultural lenses. Further along the spectrum lies alternative archaeology, popularized by researchers like Graham Hancock. This view proposes that before the rise of recognized civilizations, there may have existed advanced prehistoric cultures wiped out by global disasters. Myths, in this interpretation, are fragmented memories, stories of great teachers, lost continents, and floods that erased knowledge. The Sumerian accounts of sages bringing writing, math, and laws are taken as vestiges of an earlier age whose achievements were forgotten. Critics say this approach stretches evidence and underestimates the capabilities of early societies. Supporters argue that the sudden appearance of Sumerian sophistication suggests inheritance rather than invention. At the far end is ancient astronaut theory, championed by writers like Erich von Däniken and Zechariah Sitchin. This interpretation takes the Sumerian texts almost literally. The gods were not metaphors but extraterrestrial beings. The creation of humans was genetic engineering. The Apkallu were physical visitors, and the Sumerian understanding of astronomy reflects information given, not discovered. This view appeals to those who see anomalies in ancient architecture, mythic precision in astronomical details, or technological metaphors embedded in ritual descriptions. Its critics note linguistic errors, selective reading, and lack of direct physical evidence. Yet it remains compelling to many because it provides a coherent, if radical, explanation for the sudden rise of civilization. What is striking is that each interpretation uses the same texts but constructs a different world around them. The academic view emphasizes symbolism. The psychological view emphasizes inner experience. The comparative view emphasizes pattern and memory. The alternative archaeology view emphasizes forgotten history. The ancient astronaut view emphasizes external intervention. Each has strengths, each has blind spots, and each reveals something about human desire, our need for meaning, origins, connection, and mystery. Yet, even after all these frameworks, one question remains unresolved. What if the Sumerians themselves were not speaking metaphorically or imaginatively, but describing reality as they understood it? What if their stories reflect experiences we no longer recognize, visions we no longer access, or truths we have forgotten how to interpret? Esoteric traditions approach the Sumerian myths from a very different angle, not as literal history and not as simple symbolism, but as texts encoded with spiritual instruction. To these traditions, myths are not stories to be believed or dismissed. They are initiatory maps. Mystery schools across centuries, the priests of Egypt, the initiates of Eleusis, the Gnostic communities of late antiquity, the alchemists of medieval Europe, the Hermetic philosophers of the Renaissance treated ancient narratives as vessels carrying deeper truths. Their assumption was simple. The earliest myths encoded wisdom in layered form, revealing different meanings to different levels of understanding. Within this framework, the Sumerian creation story becomes a description of consciousness emerging from undivided potential. The primordial waters represent the unformed state of awareness, a boundless field before identity arises. Tiamat embodies the chaotic fullness from which all possibilities originate. The victory of Marduk over Tiamat is not a record of a cosmic battle, but the moment ordered consciousness emerges from primordial undifferentiation structure arising from the infinite. Humanity's creation from divine blood symbolizes the placement of that structured awareness into material form. The clay represents embodiment, the divine essence represents the spark of consciousness we carry. The gods, in this reading, are not external beings residing in far-off realms. They are aspects of the psyche, archetypal intelligences, or levels of reality that shape human experience. Enki becomes the inner voice of wisdom and intuition. Enlil represents law, discipline, and necessary structure. Their conflicts are the tensions within each individual, the pull between compassion and authority, freedom and order, creativity and control. Myths externalize these forces so the initiate can learn to recognize them internally. The flood, too, transforms meaning under esoteric interpretation. Rather than a historical deluge alone, it becomes the symbolic destruction of outdated forms of consciousness. Water cleanses, dissolves, and prepares the ground for renewal. The flood myth mirrors the spiritual process in which old identities must be washed away for transformation to occur. Atrahasis, the one chosen to survive, becomes the part of the self preserved through upheaval, carrying seeds of a new understanding. One of the most potent esoteric readings concerns the descent of Inanna. Inanna, passing through 7 gates, surrendering one garment at each, mirrors the soul's journey into embodiment, shedding its divine attributes as it descends into denser reality. Standing naked before Ereshkigal becomes the confrontation with shadow, the necessary humbling that precedes rebirth. When Inanna rises again, adorned and empowered, she symbolizes the soul reclaiming its forgotten divinity after experiencing limitation. This pattern appears in Egyptian, Greek, and Christian mystical traditions, but the Sumerian version is one of the oldest and most precise. Even the Anunnaki gain new meaning. Instead of physical gods descending from the sky, they can be seen as expressions of cosmic intelligence, archetypal forces that structure existence. Their decrees become inner laws of consciousness. Their gifts, writing, mathematics, agriculture, represent the unfolding of human potential. This interpretation allows the myths to remain spiritually powerful without requiring literal belief in extraterrestrial intervention or perfect historical accuracy. What makes this esoteric approach compelling is not that it claims to reveal the true meaning of the texts, but that it treats the myths as multidimensional. A single story can function as cosmology, psychology, philosophy, and spiritual guide. Many ancient traditions operated this way, encoding wisdom in symbols accessible only to those prepared to understand. It is possible the Sumerians did the same, crafting narratives that worked on several levels simultaneously, offering simple tales to the public and deeper teachings to initiates. Whether or not we accept the esoteric reading, it invites us to view the Sumerian myths not as dead relics, but as living texts capable of speaking to modern seekers. And whatever interpretation we choose, academic, psychological, historical, or mystical, we cannot escape one truth. The Sumerians carried insights that challenge our assumptions about the ancient world, and perhaps even about ourselves. The Sumerians lived within a universe immeasurably larger than the one most of us imagine today. For them, time did not move in a straight line from beginning to end, but flowed in vast cycles, rising and falling like tides, shaped by forces far beyond human control. Creation had happened before, destruction had happened before, and both would happen again. This cosmic rhythm framed their understanding of existence. Humanity was part of something ancient, eternal, and endlessly renewing. In contrast, modern Western culture sees history as a single story with a defined origin and a final destination. That shift changed everything. In a cyclical world, civilizations were not permanent achievements, but temporary expressions of larger patterns. The Sumerians measured time with units so immense they dwarf modern imagination. A Ner of 600 years, a Sar of 3600, and king lists that stretched dynasties back tens of thousands of years into a hazy epoch before the flood. These numbers may not be literal, yet they reveal a mindset attuned to deep time. They believed they were inheritors of forgotten ages, rebuilding upon the ruins of those who came before. Modern society, by contrast, treats anything older than a few millennia as myth or irrelevance. By collapsing the past into a tiny window of recorded history, we've lost a sense of scale. The Sumerians understood that human memory is short, but cosmic memory is long. Floods, droughts, migrations, collapses, all were part of natural cycles, not signs of personal moral failure or divine punishment. This perspective created humility. Civilizations rose not because they were chosen or superior, but because conditions allowed it, and they fell for the same reason. Modern culture, anchored in linear time, often assumes progress is inevitable and collapse unthinkable. The Sumerians would have found this belief not hopeful, but naive. This long view influenced their relationship with nature as well. Living in a land where rivers could nourish or destroy, they saw environmental cycles as expressions of cosmic order. Their rituals, offerings, and festivals were attempts to stay in alignment with forces far larger than themselves. They imagined humanity not as masters of the world, but as participants in a delicate balance. Today's worldview, shaped by linear progress narratives, often treats nature as a resource to be exhausted and the future as a problem for later generations. Without the anchoring presence of cyclical time, short-term thinking dominates our decisions. The Sumerians also carried an awareness of impermanence that modern culture rarely embraces. Cities rose, prospered, and eventually crumbled into dust. Entire dynasties vanished beneath new layers of settlement. Yet instead of despairing, they accepted this as the rhythm of existence. Nothing was eternal except the cycles themselves. Our world, by contrast, often behaves as though collapse is impossible, an illusion reinforced by technology, nationalism, and economic growth models. But history shows that civilizations are fragile. The Sumerian perspective reminds us that survival depends not on denying impermanence, but on respecting it, preparing for change rather than resisting it. Perhaps the greatest loss is the humility that comes from seeing humanity as part of a much older and larger story. The Sumerians understood themselves as heirs to forgotten ages, not the beginning of history but a continuation of something vast. Modern culture, centered on recent achievements, often imagines itself as unprecedented. We treat our technologies, governments, and crises as unique, failing to recognize that earlier civilizations faced similar challenges and survived or collapsed according to how well they adapted. The Sumerian mindset, grounded in cycles, would urge us to look beyond the present moment and consider the deeper patterns unfolding around us. Recovering even a fraction of this cosmic perspective could reshape how we face the future. Instead of assuming our civilization will endure indefinitely, we might recognize the fragility inherent in all human achievements. Instead of treating crises as unprecedented catastrophes, we might see them as part of larger cycles that demand adaptation rather than panic. And instead of imagining ourselves as the apex of history, we might understand that we are one chapter in an ancient story still unfolding. The Sumerians invite us to remember the long view and to act with the wisdom it requires. To the Sumerians, knowledge was never casual. It was not information to be collected, filed, or debated. It was power real, active, world-shaping power that moved through the universe the way lightning moves through a storm. The me, those divine decrees that structured everything from kingship to craftsmanship to love itself, were not metaphors. They were forces. To possess a me was to embody its function, to channel its potency into the world. The me of rulership did not simply describe how to rule, it conferred the right and ability to rule. The me of the sacred rites did not describe worship, it made one capable of opening the gate between human and divine realms. In this worldview, knowledge was not something anyone could simply pick up. It demanded preparation, responsibility, and alignment. To receive a me without the proper readiness was considered dangerous. This is why certain tablets were sealed in clay envelopes, why ritual texts were written in obscure language, accessible only to priests, why initiation levels determined who could read what. Knowledge had weight. It had consequences, and it could easily harm those who handled it without the inner structure to hold it. Contrast this with the modern world, where information is treated as an endless stream, free, frictionless, and often overwhelming. Everything is available instantly, from the trivial to the profound, all flattened into the same digital landscape. We value access above context, quantity above depth. The Sumerians would find this strange, even reckless. To them, knowledge without grounding was like fire without a hearth, capable of illumination, but just as capable of burning down the structure that held it. We live in an age where we know more facts than any civilization before us, yet wisdom feels increasingly scarce. Our devices offer infinite information, but little understanding. We scroll endlessly, accumulating fragments without integration, confusing data saturation with intelligence. The Sumerians might say we have uncoupled knowledge from meaning, consumed the surface while losing the substance. Without a framework to hold knowledge, without inner discipline or guidance, information becomes noise. Mystery traditions throughout history echoed this concern. Egyptian priests taught that certain truths required years of moral training before they could be safely revealed. Greek initiates of Eleusis underwent rigorous preparation before receiving sacred insights. Gnostics claimed that divine knowledge was a matter of inner transformation, not casual instruction. Medieval alchemists warned that only the prepared mind could benefit from their teachings. To others, the same ideas could induce confusion or destruction. Across cultures, the principle was the same. The vessel human consciousness had to be shaped before it could hold certain truths. Modern culture often mocks this idea as elitism, imagining that all limits on knowledge arise from control or gatekeeping. But what if the ancients were not trying to hoard power, but protect the unprepared? What if they recognized that certain insights require maturity, humility, and inner clarity qualities our age rarely cultivates? A powerful idea given to an unsteady mind can amplify fear, ego, or fragmentation. A profound concept handed to the unready can become dangerous, not because the idea is harmful, but because the vessel receiving it is unstable. The Sumerians embedded this understanding directly into their myths. When Inanna steals the me from Enki, the world briefly plunges into chaos. When humans receive writing, law, or kingship without proper balance, disaster follows. Knowledge must be earned, not merely obtained. It must be integrated, not downloaded. Today, we operate with the opposite assumption, that free access ensures empowerment. Yet our culture often seems disoriented, overwhelmed by information yet starved for direction. Perhaps this is because we have forgotten the distinction between information and wisdom, between possessing facts and embodying understanding. Perhaps we have made knowledge too easy, stripping away the structures that once guided seekers toward depth, transformation, and responsibility. In our rush to democratize all knowledge, have we lost the frameworks that once made knowledge sacred, capable of changing who we are, rather than merely filling our minds? The Sumerians believed wisdom shaped reality. Modern culture believes information shapes convenience. Between those worldviews lies a gulf that may explain much of our present confusion. And this brings us to one final loss, perhaps the most profound of all: the Sumerian understanding of humanity's relationship with the divine, and what that relationship implied about our potential, our purpose, and our forgotten origins. In the Sumerian worldview, the relationship between humans and the divine was not one of absolute separation, nor one of equality. It was something in between, an ambiguous, dynamic bond born from the very substance of creation. Humans were crafted from clay, shaped from the earth, yet animated with the blood of a god. This mixture was not a poetic flourish. It defined the human condition. We were mortal, fallible, destined to toil. But within the limits of our bodies, a spark of divine consciousness flickered, capable of understanding, creating, and transforming. This dual nature formed a covenant far older than any written scripture. Humans existed to serve the gods, but they were also kin to them. This idea stands in stark contrast to the theological frameworks that later came to dominate the ancient Near East. In much of Christianity and Islam, God is wholly other, immaterial, perfect, omnipotent, and utterly distinct from creation. Humans are made by God, but not of God. The gap between divine and human is unbridgeable. To attempt to cross it is considered arrogance, blasphemy, or rebellion. Stories like the Tower of Babel or the fall of Lucifer warn that reaching upward beyond one's station invites catastrophe. The Sumerians told a different story. Their gods could elevate humans or walk among them. They could grant immortality, as they did to Ziusudra after the flood. They could bestow wisdom surpassing even divine messengers, as Enki did for Adapa. Heroes like Gilgamesh, though denied eternal life, came close enough to taste it. In this cosmology, divinity was not locked behind a wall. It was a continuum. Humans could rise. Gods could err. The boundary between the two was porous, a liminal space where knowledge, skill, and inner awakening could draw one closer to the divine state. When later religions replaced this framework, something was gained, but something was also lost. What was gained was moral coherence, a universe governed by a single, just deity rather than a council of quarrelsome gods. People found comfort in the idea of a loving creator who cared for them personally and provided a path to salvation. They found clarity in commandments and laws that offered structure, purpose, and meaning. But what was lost was a profound sense of human potential. In the monotheistic view, humans could be righteous, wise, obedient, or blessed, but never divine. Divinity was unreachable, reserved exclusively for the Creator. Any attempt to access divine power was reinterpreted as sin or pride. The Sumerian belief that humans bore divine essence literally carried within their being became incompatible with later doctrine. And so the older covenant faded. The idea that we are partial gods in chrysalis, beings capable of transformation, no longer fit the narratives of obedience and hierarchy that took root. The message that knowledge could elevate us, that ritual could awaken us, that our divine spark could grow into something greater, became marginalized or condemned. Power structures, both religious and political, had reasons to downplay such concepts. A populace convinced of its innate divinity is harder to control than one convinced of its helplessness. Yet the Sumerians seem to have held a more daring view of the human journey. To them, we were not static creations but beings in process. The divine blood in our veins was not only a mark of origin, but a hint of destiny. Perhaps they believed that humanity's true role was not merely to serve the gods, but to eventually join them, or at least rise closer to their level through wisdom, discipline, and inner transformation. This interpretation is neither literal nor fantastical. It is a philosophical reading of what the myths imply. The Forgotten Covenant was not a contract written on tablets, but a story about identity. It told humanity, you were shaped from earth so you could live in the world, but you were infused with divinity so you would not remain limited by it. Your task is to remember what you carry and grow it into its fullest expression. In losing this idea, we may have lost more than an ancient worldview. We may have lost a guiding vision of what it means to be human, not finished, not fixed, but capable of becoming. And now, having journeyed from the primordial deep to the brink of forgotten knowledge, only one question remains. What do we do with all of this? In the digital age, the oldest written voices on Earth are gaining new life. Scattered across museums and storerooms around the world lie roughly 500,000 cuneiform tablets, clay records, pressed with wedge-shaped signs, more than 4,000 years ago. For centuries they remained silent, unreadable except to a small group of specialists. Even today, only a fraction have been fully translated. Beneath layers of dust and time, whole epics, rituals and teachings may still be waiting. Some tablets list mundane inventories, but others contain myths or instructions that have never been studied. When we speak of what the Sumerians believed, we're speaking from a narrow window. The rest remains hidden in clay. Yet something remarkable is happening. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative are working to photograph, scan, and upload tens of thousands of tablets, making them available in high resolution to anyone with an internet connection. Scholars collaborate across continents without leaving their desks. Students who have never set foot in Iraq can examine tablets once locked behind museum glass. The Sumerian language, once the domain of a few experts, now has online grammars, glossaries, and forums where learners share discoveries. For the first time, the barrier between the ancient scribes and the modern world is thinning. This democratization of access changes everything. A century ago, only a handful of scholars determined what the tablets meant. Today, independent researchers, students, and curious readers can view the same artifacts and sometimes propose interpretations scholars overlooked. It does not replace academic rigor, but it widens the conversation. The ancient voices no longer pass through a single filter. They can be heard directly, raw and unmediated, carrying the cadence of a world that still feels strangely familiar. But alongside this progress is loss. Many tablets remain in Iraq and Syria, regions devastated by war. During the years of ISIS occupation, museums were looted, archaeological sites bulldozed, and priceless artifacts shattered. Some tablets disappeared into private collections. Others were burned, pulverized, or lost to chaos. Each destroyed tablet is a vanished memory, an erased sentence in humanity's oldest story. Archaeologists describe a sense of racing against time, trying to preserve what remains before conflict or decay takes more. Clay survives for millennia underground, but once exposed, it becomes fragile, vulnerable to moisture, mishandling, or indifference. Still, hope persists. Excavations continue in safer regions. New tablets surface in museum archives previously overlooked. Every year, newly translated texts reshape our understanding of Sumerian belief, revealing nuances scholars missed or assumptions that need revising. The record is expanding, deepening, becoming more complex. In a way, the Sumerians are speaking again, not through myth or imagination, but in their own words. And as more tablets come online, more people can listen. For the first time since their civilization collapsed, the Sumerian voice isn't limited by geography, politics, or scarcity. Anyone, anywhere, can open a digital archive and peer into the thoughts of a scribe who lived before the pyramids were built. The clay remembers, and now, so can we. But accessing these tablets is only the beginning. The real question is what we choose to do with what we find, how we integrate ancient Sumerian wisdom into modern life without romanticizing the past or reducing it to entertainment. It's one thing to admire Sumerian wisdom from a distance. It's another to let it shape the way we live. Their worldview may be thousands of years old, but it offers perspectives that feel startlingly relevant to modern seekers navigating uncertainty, information overload, and spiritual hunger. We cannot return to their world, nor should we. But we can borrow the threads of insight that still shimmer beneath the dust and weave them into the fabric of our own lives, quietly, personally, without dogma. One of the simplest practices is adopting a cyclical sense of time. The Sumerians understood that life unfolds in rhythms: creation, growth, decline, renewal. Civilizations followed these arcs, so did individuals. Modern culture prefers straight lines, constant progress, or total collapse, but reality rarely behaves that way. When challenges arise, thinking in cycles can soften panic and cultivate resilience. A difficult phase is not the end, it is a moment within a larger spiral. By observing where we are in our own cycles, emotionally, professionally, spiritually, we learn patience. We learn that decline can precede regeneration, and that every ending reshapes the soil for beginnings we cannot yet see. Another practice is treating knowledge as sacred rather than superficial. In Sumer, learning wasn't about accumulating data, it was a transformation, a shift in being. We can mirror this by becoming intentional about what we absorb and how we integrate it. Instead of consuming information passively, we can create small rituals around study: reading slowly, reflecting afterward, journaling insights, approaching new ideas with reverence rather than haste. It doesn't matter what the subject is: myth, science, art. What matters is the attitude. Knowledge becomes nourishment when approached with presence. A third invitation is embracing our dual nature. The Sumerians believed humans were both clay and divine essence, limited yet luminous. Modern culture often swings between extremes. Either we're fragile animals destined for meaninglessness, or we imagine we must transcend our humanity entirely to be worthy. The Sumerian perspective offers a gentler balance. Acknowledge your boundaries, your fatigue, your fears, your imperfections, without forgetting that creativity, consciousness, and intuition are divine qualities moving through you. Holding both truths at once creates humility without diminishing possibility. It allows us to strive without self-punishment and to accept mistakes without abandoning growth. The Sumerians also teach us to engage with mystery rather than force certainty. Their myths contradict themselves, their gods behave unpredictably, their cosmos is layered and ambiguous. Instead of demanding final answers, they lived with the questions, using ritual and story to explore the unknown. In a world addicted to instant explanations, we can practice resting in uncertainty, allow space for the unanswerable, value the experience of seeking rather than the security of fixed conclusions. Mystery isn't confusion, it's the horizon of understanding. Finally, we can reconnect with the elemental and cosmic awareness that shaped the Sumerian mind. They saw divinity in wind, water, earth, starlight, not as metaphor, but as presence. We don't need temples or offerings to cultivate similar awareness. We can spend a few moments watching the sky at night, noticing the slow drift of stars. We can pay attention to seasonal shifts, to moon phases, to the quiet rhythms of nature that still pulse beneath modern noise. These small acts recalibrate us. They remind us that we live within a larger story, one written not in texts but in tides, sunlight, and soil. None of these practices are commandments. They are invitations, ways to experiment with ancient perspectives, to see if they widen something in us, deepen something, or help us navigate the complexities of contemporary life with a bit more clarity and calm. The Sumerian worldview is not a destination but a lens, a way of remembering that wisdom comes from many ages, and that even the oldest voices can speak directly to the present moment. But perhaps the deepest gift the Sumerians offer isn't practical guidance at all. It is something more fundamental, something we urgently need as we face an uncertain future. In the quiet that follows our long journey, it becomes easier to feel how ancient these stories truly are. We began among the ruins of southern Iraq, in places where the wind moves through broken walls, and the earth still holds the memory of cities older than memory itself. From those silent foundations, we climbed into the realms of heaven, sat among divine assemblies, and drifted through primordial waters where creation first shimmered into being. We walked with gods, with sages, with kings who sought truths greater than their time allowed. And through it all, a single thread wound its way forward, the human desire to understand why we are here. The Sumerians pressed their questions into clay because they feared forgetting. They lived beside rivers that could nourish or destroy, under skies where stars seemed to speak in careful patterns. They witnessed floods, invasions, droughts, the collapse of dynasties, the vanishing of entire languages. Yet they believed that meaning could survive even the worst devastation, that if they engraved their stories deeply enough, some future hand would find them and remember. And that future hand is ours. Thousands of years after their cities turn to dust, their voices rise again through the patient work of archaeologists, translators, and anyone willing to open a digital archive and peer into the past. Their myths are not only about gods or cosmic battles, they're about continuity through catastrophe, about the fragile yet persistent thread of memory that binds one age to the next. They remind us that destruction is never final. Something always remains an idea, a story, a whisper. When we read their tablets, we're not looking at a vanished people. We're looking at ancestors in curiosity. They wondered what lay beyond the visible world. They asked what created them, what governed their fate, what waited after death. They searched for order in chaos, for meaning in suffering, for reassurance that existence was not random. These are the same questions we ask now, whispered in bedrooms at night, pondered in moments of uncertainty or awe. The details change, the yearning does not. And perhaps that is the quiet message we carry forward. Not a secret teaching or hidden map, but the simple truth that we have always made sense of the world by telling stories, by reaching backward and forward at once. The Sumerians endured calamities that reshaped their world, yet they trusted that knowledge could outlive them. They trusted that someone somewhere in the distant future would listen. Tonight, as you settle into rest, you carry echoes from 6 millennia ago, echoes left by hands pressing symbols into wet clay under oil lamps, echoes of a people who refused to let their understanding fade, who believed that meaning persists even when everything else is lost. Their voices are part of you now, woven into the long human effort to remember who we are. Maybe the real creation story is not about the beginning of the world at all. Maybe it is about how we keep beginning again and again, each time we rediscover what was nearly forgotten.